Peace and blessings. Today's post entitled Free Your Dome to Speech or Freedom of Speech. Living in very good instructional times, if you're, like I said before in a previous post, as an educator, if you're an educator and you like to incorporate current events within your instruction. So right now, as we've known, as I'm doing this post, we're in the midst of Mr. Trump's last several days in office, and now uh, his opposition are building cases in reference to linking him to the insurrection that took place or the protest turned riot turned breach of Capitol building that took place on January 6th. And what seems to be the vocal point or key will be speech, what he said, and if it ignited, and if it can be proven that it ignited those to breach and do what they did, damage, death, at the state capitol, at the federal capitol in D.C. In this country, a lot of us, we will say what we want to say and say, it's my First Amendment right. I have the freedom of speech. And as I said in my previous post, that, and I used the example of going into a theater and yelling fire, and if there is no fire. So if you know there was no fire, but yet you falsely made that claim and it caused people to die and caused property damage, that's against the law. And then I laid out that given the the lawsuits that were presented across the country by Mr. Trump's teams, and that they were all thrown out, one can then surmise and make the point that it was known that according to the law, that there was no widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. So by then using words and continue to use words in speeches, tweets by Mr. Trump and those who support him, that's likened to falsely claiming a fire when you knew there was no fire. So I'll take it just a tad bit further, which makes it interesting because now this is potentially precedents being set. Because then also in what I just stated and watching this across the different news networks that I was paying attention to, there's also talk of potentially bringing forth, I say sanctions, but it's not sanctions, I'm thinking sports, but bringing forth punishment to those who get on the air or get on Medium and assert lies and continue to assert lies to prove a point, which then could potentially lead to, if not something as major as the breach of the Capitol building in D.C., but can lead to other types of damage or property damage and or assaulting, bodily harm and or death to individuals because of said lies and people saying, I have the right to say these things. You may have the right to say it, but as there's an adage that says freedom, let's say freedom of speech, but freedom ain't always free. There's a price for the freedom of speech. And it would seem that quite a few people did not get that memo, don't subscribe to it, could care less because they've been able to get away with it. And now it's seemingly coming back to bite in the behind those who are now enacting out their anger and their frustration because of, according to the law, believing in lies that have been told to them about widespread voter fraud and a stealing of an election. With that being said, critical thought is always good because then it provides you the mechanism and the tool to look at things and assess them properly so that one does not get caught up easily in the mob mentality. Because again, as I'm doing this post, there are those who are now starting to assert that the only reason they were there, meaning at the rallies, the only reason that they went to the Capitol building, the only reason that they breached the Capitol building was because they thought that's what Mr. Trump wanted them to do. So now folks telling on each other, trying to save behind. That's why I said this is an interesting time to be an educator and hearing information on cases such as the analogy I gave about the fire going into a theater and just learning law and seeing how it's being played out in the media, conservative and or so-called liberal and so-called conservative people building their cases, and these networks are laying it out. So again, be mindful, be wise in your speech because it's being monitored also, as you should have known, but if you don't, it's being monitored on social media because they're also putting out on these networks how many thousands of tweets and messages being put out in reference to potentially further armed protests. And these individuals and groups who are doing such are speaking freely, no pun intended, actually pun intended, about what they're going to do violently, be it at the nation's capital or in states' capitals. So it should be interesting to see how far legally punishment will be done and or censorship will be done based upon the quote freedom of speech people feel that they have, but we'll see how far that freedom is given. And I pause because it's just interesting to me when I say freedom is given, when freedom can't be given. You have your freedom or you don't. So anyway, interesting times because precedents will be set, and this precedents will then be policy and or law which will be used against everyone as time moves forward. So just want to share that. One love, peace, Wakanda forever. Get some rest, vitamin D, laugh a lot, exercise, release energy, take energy in, use it, release it so it does not become dis-ease. One.